Chapter 10, Modern Resonance, where these ideas live today and current criticisms. Plato's portraits survive not just as antiquarian curiosities but as living interlocutors. The questions he raised: what is real? What is a just life? How should we educate citizens and rulers, continue to echo through classrooms, courtrooms, laboratories, and digital forums. In this chapter, we trace how the core grooves of his thought, metaphysical realism, ethical telos, political guardianship, and the pedagogy of virtue, have been reinterpreted, reproposed, or rejected in modern thought. We will look both at the places where Platonic resonance remains audible and at the criticisms that have swelled around those echoes. The aim is not to polemically defend or demolish Plato, but to map the currents in which his ideas still swim and to show why they matter in the 21st century. 1. The Republic as a blueprint, a warning, and a thought experiment. When modern readers encounter Plato's Republic, they often feel they are facing a blueprint or a manifesto for a well-ordered state. Yet most contemporary political theorists view the dialogue less as a manual than as a disciplined thought experiment. It asks provocative questions about the nature of justice, the aims of education, and the structure of political authority. In this sense, Plato's text survives by functioning as a device that forces us to test our assumptions. Where the modern resonance lies most clearly is in the insistence that political legitimacy cannot rest on force alone or on appeals to tradition. The Republic's critique of unexamined power, to the extent that it is read through the lens of modern liberal democratic skepticism, appears as a precursor to debates about deliberation, equal citizenship, and the possibility that rulers ought to be educated for their tasks. The philosopher king figure, an archetype rather than a real political program, serves as a cautionary horizon, a reminder that wisdom, virtue, and a certain disinterest in personal gain are not simply personal qualities but social prerequisites. In contemporary discourse, we hear echoes of this in arguments about the education of leaders, the need for transparency, and the dangers of demagoguery. Yet the Republic's more controversial strands, its hierarchical ordering of society, its calls for censorship of poetry and myth, and its rationale for compulsory education and eugenic-like premises about the fitness of guardians, remain a source of sharp critique. The modern reader, especially one steeped in liberal, pluralistic, or egalitarian norms, is likely to view these elements with suspicion. The dialogue becomes not a blueprint but a thought-provoking contrast, a radical ideal of justice that cannot be realized without trade-offs that modern sensibilities deem unacceptable. The result is a double move in contemporary thought, to reclaim the value of universal aims, justice, virtue, the common good, while insisting that those aims be realized through procedures that respect individual rights, plural identities, and open contestation. 2. Epistemology, realism, and the cave in the information age. Plato's theory of knowledge, seeing the forms, in themselves, rather than merely their appearances, belongs to a long lineage of epistemological realism. In modern terms, the question becomes, are there objective structures of reality that our minds can intelligibly grasp? And if so, how do those structures relate to the more messy, contingent data of experience, science, and technology? Today, mathematics, physics, and the cognitive sciences offer a particularly fertile ground for Platonic resonance. Mathematical Platonism, the view that mathematical objects exist independently of us, appears to resonate with Plato's commitment to intelligible, objective forms. The success of mathematics in describing the physical world often earns it the label of Platonist realism in contemporary discussions, even when mathematicians themselves would resist the historical baggage of Plato's metaphysical forms. The question then becomes more nuanced: do we have access to an abstract realm of timeless truths, or are we dealing with highly successful conventions that structure our experience? The cave allegory has proven especially adaptable in the digital era. The cave, shadows on a wall, the journey of ascent, the disruptive encounter with true light, has become a vivid metaphor for our encounters with screens, algorithms, and social media. If the cave is a symbol of illusion and dependence on appearances, today it is also a warning about informational bubbles, confirmation bias, and the seductions of data-driven narratives. Yet the cave remains ambiguous. Is the ascent toward knowledge a solitary conquest, or is it a public, dialogic process that requires communities to examine and revise what they take to be true? Modern philosophers, cognitive scientists, and media theorists ask variations of this question as they debate the reliability of information, the nature of belief, and the role of technological mediation in epistemic life. In this way, Plato's epistemology persists not as a set of dogmatic claims but as a framework for interrogating how we come to know. It invites a sober acknowledgement that appearances matter, perhaps more than we would wish in our era of rapid information cycles, while insisting that appearances tempt us toward illusion. The modern challenge, then, is to cultivate epistemic virtues in a world of abundant data, fostering critical habits that resist both gullible credulity and cynical relativism. 3. Forms, universals, and the mathematics of representation. Plato's forms offer a strikingly ambitious account of the stability and universality of essential properties. Justice itself, beauty itself, the good itself are not reducible to contingent instances but have a being beyond any particular person, culture, or era. Contemporary debates about universals, natural kinds, and abstraction echo these concerns, even as the terminology shifts. In the philosophy of mathematics, Platonic intuition remains influential. Mathematical Platonism holds that mathematical entities exist independently of human minds. Critics, by contrast, argue for nominalism or fictionalism, that mathematical objects are not real in a robust sense but are useful fictions or constructs of human language. The middle ground, structural realism or structuralism, tries to reconcile the intuition of an objective mathematical landscape with the recognition that our access to that landscape is mediated by formal systems, symbols, and human conventions. The result is a modern lineage of Platonism that reframes the forms as structural likenesses and patterns rather than as timeless, separate things. Yet the appeal remains, the sense that there are deep, persistent structures that give shape to our experience and science. In the sciences more broadly, debates about realism versus anti-realism mirror these concerns. Do the entities posited by scientific theories, electrons, quarks, space-time geometries, mirror real structures in the world, or are they simply instruments for predicting observations? The majority of contemporary scientific realism leans toward a middle position that accepts a robust realist commitment to success and explanatory power while acknowledging the theory-ladenness and underdetermination of scientific hypotheses. This posture, in its measured optimism, echoes Plato's insistence on intelligible order and the possibility of genuine knowledge, even if we now frame the pursuit in terms of empirical adequacy, pragmatic success, and explanatory coherence rather than in terms of timeless ideal forms. 4. Education and leadership, guardianship as a metaphor for modern pedagogy. In Plato's world, education is a matter of cultivating virtue and wisdom in the limited, but crucial, class of rulers and auxiliaries. The modern counterpart may be the broad emphasis on education as character formation, critical thinking, and civic virtue. The guardian model becomes a metaphor for the responsibilities that accompany power and influence. The modern analog may reside not in a rigid, hereditary elite but in elite-educated elites, leaders in government, business, journalism, and academia who are expected to embody and transmit certain ethical commitments, systemic understandings, and long-term perspectives. This reading has a double edge. On the one hand, it justifies large-scale investments in education, leadership development, and public service as a form of societal safeguarding, teaching citizens to think deeply about justice, the common good, and the long arc of political life. On the other hand, it risks reproducing gatekeeping, technocracy, and a sense that only a few possess the moral and intellectual capital necessary to guide the polity. Modern critiques, especially from feminist and democratic theory, urge caution. Education should democratize access to wisdom, not consecrate a single path to power. They press Plato to account for plural voices, dissenting perspectives, and the moral significance of everyday political participation, not just the virtues of a ruling class. 5. virtue, ethics, and the problem of universals in a plural age. The ascent from the cave is not just epistemic, it is ethical. The Republic links knowledge with virtue, arguing that true knowledge of the good bears fruit in just action and communal harmony. The modern appeal of virtue ethics, most notably in the work of Alastair MacIntyre, Philippa Foot, and others, reads Plato through a different lens, not a systematic metaphysical account of the forms but a focus on practices, virtues, and the cultivation of character within communities. In contemporary moral theory, this turns into two major strands. The first sees virtue ethics as a corrective to a purely rule-based or consequence-based approach to ethics, offering a more holistic, socially embedded understanding of what it means to live well. The second treats universal moral claims with suspicion, insisting that cultures and individuals have diverse, context-sensitive visions of the good life. Plato's insistence on universals, the good, justice, the true, is thus both attractive and contentious. The contemporary debate often reframes universals as ideals that can guide practice without erasing difference, or as aspirational standards that must be re-evaluated in light of democratic inclusion and social justice. 6. Aesthetics, poetry, and the politics of culture. Plato's suspicion of poets in the Republic, seen as peddlers of illusion who undermine rational order, has become a touchstone for enduring debates about culture, censorship, and the purpose of art. Modern discussions about the relationship between art and politics are rarely so one-sided as to endorse censorship, yet they continue to wrestle with the claims that literature, film, music, and visual culture have on shaping values, identities, and social imagination. Today's critics emphasize the liberating, democratizing potential of culture as well as its power to polarize. The noble lie that Plato worries about, whether myths or narratives that stabilize the city, appears in modern form as political propaganda, nationalist myths, or corporate branding. The question for modern readers becomes, how can culture retain its critical edge and imaginative power without becoming a tool of domination? The answer often lies in pluralist institutions, robust media literacy, and the cultivation of spaces for dissent, satire, and cross-cultural conversation. 7. Religion, metaphysics, and the science-nature divide. Plato's metaphysical commitments sit uneasily in many modern secular and scientific contexts. Yet his work also intersects with religious and philosophical attempts to articulate a durable sense of the transcendent, the good, and the ultimate nature of reality. In some Christian philosophical traditions, Platonic thought has served as a bridge, an account of the immaterial, a teleological ordering of the cosmos, and a legible ascent toward higher truth. In other religious and philosophical currents, however, Platonic idealism is tied to a rationalist project that clashes with religious accounts of revelation, contingency, or the role of miracle. Modern critics ask whether the Platonic search for universals can coexist with a scientifically informed naturalism that emphasizes process, contingency, and the historical shaping of beliefs. The question of how, or whether, to integrate the search for universal form with empirical constraints remains a live debate. The upshot is not a rejection of metaphysical questions, but a reframing. Metaphysical questions persist, but they must be posed with humility about human epistemic limits and with openness to a broader spectrum of ways of knowing. 8. Critics, challenges, and the risk of intellectual inbreeding. The broad modern criticism of Platonic appropriation begins with a discomfort with elitism, the sense that Plato's ladder of ascent, education, purification of desire, ascent to the realm of the good, could justify a social order that stifles difference, dissent, and democratic participation. Critics from feminist, post-colonial, and critical theory vantage points argue that the Republic's model can easily slide into forms of power that suppress the many in the name of the needs of the few. There are also methodological criticisms. Plato's method, addressing moral and metaphysical problems through dialectic and the construction of thought experiments, has been celebrated for its productivity and criticized for its lack of empirical testability. Philosophers of science and empirical social scientists often prefer methods that emphasize observation, experimentation, and replication. The worry is not that Plato's questions are irrelevant, but that his answers risk being insufficiently provisional or overly explanatory by appeal to a rationalist form of justification that modern science has moved beyond. Finally, some critics argue that Platonic essentialism undervalues the significance of difference. The insistence that there exist universal, knowable forms undermines the legitimacy of local, contingent, or culturally specific ways of understanding. In today's pluralistic world, such an account can seem not merely outdated but dangerous if it fuels a kind of metaphysical justification for social hierarchies or for the suppression of minority voices. The challenge for any modern engagement with Plato is to extract the enduring questions about justice, knowledge, and virtue while remaining wary of the more absolutist tendencies his system can invite. 9. Rereading Plato, Contemporary Harmonies and Reconciliations. Despite criticisms, Plato remains an invaluable interlocutor for contemporary philosophy and public life when reread with care. Several productive strands of modern interpretation have emerged. Philosophy as disciplined public reasoning, the Republic's emphasis on education and rational debate resonates with contemporary commitments to deliberative democracy, critical thinking, and civic education. The idea that a polity benefits from citizens who are capable of reasoning about long-term consequences and who can discipline their appetites for the sake of the common good remains compelling. Virtue ethics as a framework for public responsibility. The revival of virtue ethics provides a language to articulate character, integrity, and responsibility in leadership, education, and professional life. Rather than reducing ethics to rules or consequences alone, this approach foregrounds practice, habit, and the cultivation of meaningful communities. The cave as a prompt for media literacy. In an age of algorithmic curation and filter bubbles, Plato's cave is a vivid reminder to interrogate the sources of our beliefs, to seek situational awareness, and to cultivate the ability to recognize and resist manipulation. Platonism in discourse about mathematics and science. The modern dialogue about universals, realism, and abstraction uses Plato's mold to interrogate what we mean by objectivity, structure, and intelligible order. The usefulness of the form versus appearance dichotomy persists, but it is reframed in terms of structural explanation, representation, and the epistemology of science. Education as a public good. The modern emphasis on education, its accessibility, its role in social mobility, and its capacity to shape citizenship, reflects a reimagined version of the Guardian's task: prepare individuals not for specialization alone but for morally responsible participation in a shared life. 10. A closing sense of place. Why Plato endures. If we listen carefully, Plato's portrait of the philosopher offers a glimmer of a larger conviction, that human beings are capable of discerning what is good not by accident but through disciplined inquiry, communal conversation, and a shared longing for truth. The modern resonance of his ideas does not mean we must adopt his program wholesale, rather, it invites us to sharpen our own tools for thinking about justice, knowledge, and responsibility in a world that is more interconnected and more contested than ever. 2 cautions shape any careful engagement with his legacy. First, avoid the temptation to treat his thought as a blueprint for a single, unassailable social order. The strength of Plato's work lies in the kinds of questions it provokes and the moral seriousness it confers on the enterprise of philosophy, not in the uniformity of its prescriptions. Second, resist the impulse to dismiss him outright because some of his conclusions strike a modern reader as intolerant or illiberal. Even where we repudiate specific conclusions, such as compulsory censorship or rigid caste-like stratification, the exercise of interrogating those conclusions remains a valuable method for testing our own. The modern resonance of Plato, then, is not a matter of doctrinal continuity but of interpretive persistence. His dialogues continue to function as laboratories for thought, places where we can test our assumptions about what makes life meaningful, how communities should be organized, how knowledge is acquired, and what it means to educate for a future we cannot entirely predict. The current criticisms are not the end of the conversation but a signal that the conversation has grown in sophistication and scope. If we are honest about the difficulties, we can use Plato's questions to illuminate the complexities of contemporary life, rather than reduce them to easy answers. 11. practical implications for readers today. Think in terms of long-term goods. Plato's insistence on teleology invites contemporary readers to weigh actions not only by immediate consequences but by their contribution to a more enduring good, societal virtue, trust, and democratic legitimacy. Cultivate discernment in education. If leadership and citizenship require more than technical competence, then education should emphasize critical thinking, moral reasoning, and exposure to diverse perspectives. The goal is not to indoctrinate but to empower thoughtful, reflective participation in public life. Balance universals with pluralism. The appeal to universal forms can be metabolized into universalizable ethical commitments, dignity, justice, fairness, while remaining attentive to cultural difference and historical context. The challenge is to uphold universal ideals without erasing particular voices. Foster a healthier information ecology. The cave metaphor becomes a tool for media literacy. Recognizing the seductions of appearances, whether political, corporate, or ideological, can help individuals and communities cultivate habits of scrutiny, dialogue, and openness to revision. Reimagine guardianship as service. If power must be stewarded, it should be trained, accountable, and oriented toward the common good. This involves transparent institutions, robust checks and balances, and continuous reflexivity about who gets to decide what counts as the good life. In sum, Chapter 10 is not a verdict on Plato but a map of his modern afterlives. The ideas he pressed, about reality, knowledge, justice, and education, have not vanished, they have adapted to new problems and new conversations. The challenge for readers today is to carry forward what is valuable while remaining vigilant about limitations. If we can do that, Plato's portrait will continue to be not merely a somber historical figure or an abstract ideal but a living interlocutor in our ongoing effort to understand what it means to live well in a complicated world.